In the course of the next 2 hours, he came upon several similar traps. Usually, the snow above the hidden pools of water had a sunken, textured appearance that advertised the danger. Once again, however, he had a close call, and once again, suspecting danger, he compelled the dog to walk in front of him. The dog did not want to go. It hung back until the man shoved it forward. It then went quickly across the white, unbroken surface. Suddenly, it broke through. It floundered to one side and got away to firmer footing. It had wet its forefeet and legs. Almost immediately, the water turned to ice. It made quick efforts to lick the ice off its legs. Then it dropped down in the snow and began to bite out the ice that formed between its toes. This was all a matter of instinct. To permit the ice to remain would mean sore feet. It did not know this. It did not think or reason. It merely obeyed the mysterious prompting that arose from the depth of its being. It acted on instinct. But the man knew, making a judgment on this situation, what needed to be done. He removed the mitten from his right hand and helped the dog tear out the ice particles. He did not expose his fingers for more than a minute, and yet was astonished how swiftly they became numb. It was certainly cold. He put the mitten back on hastily and savagely beat his hand across his chest. At 12 o'clock, the day was at its brightest, yet the sun still did not clear the horizon. The man walked under the clear, sunless sky and cast no shadow. At 12:30 to the minute, he arrived at the fork in the creek. He was pleased at the time he had made. If he kept up this pace, he would certainly be with his friends by 6. He unbuttoned his jacket and took out his lunch. This action took no more than a few seconds, yet in that brief moment, his exposed fingers became numb. He did not put the mitten back on, but instead sharply struck his fingers against his leg to fight that numbness. Then he sat down on a snow-covered log to eat. The sensation he felt following striking his fingers against his leg disappeared so quickly that he was startled. He didn't even have a chance to take a bite of his biscuit. He struck his fingers repeatedly in a struggle against the numbness and returned them to his mitten, baring the other hand for the purpose of eating. He tried to take a mouthful, but the ice around his mouth had prevented him from eating. He had forgotten to build a fire and thaw out. He chuckled in his foolishness. As he chuckled, he noticed the numbness creeping back into his exposed fingers. He also noticed the stinging which he had felt in his toes when he sat down was already passing away. He wondered whether his toes were warm or numb. He moved them inside his moccasins and decided they were numb. He pulled his mutton on hurriedly and stood up. He was a bit frightened. He stamped up and down until the stinging returned to his feet. It was certainly cold. That old-timer he met from Sulphur Creek had spoken the truth when warning him how cold it sometimes got in the country, and he had laughed at him at the time. This showed him one must not be too sure of things. There was no mistake about it. It was cold. He walked up and down, stamping his feet and thrashing his arms until he was reassured by the returning warmth. Then he got out matches and proceeded to make a fire. He dug down and found some seasoned twigs and branches lodged in the ground from the previous spring. Working carefully from a small beginning, he soon had a roaring fire over which he thawed the ice from his face. In the protection of the fire, he ate his biscuits. For the moment, he had outwitted the cold. The dog, too, took satisfaction in the fire, stretching out close enough for warmth and far enough away to escape being singed. When the man finished eating, he filled his pipe and took his time having a smoke. Then he put on his mittens, settled the ear flaps of his cap firmly over his ears, and continued walking on the trail by the creek. The dog was disappointed and yearned to go back to the fire. The dog knew that it was not good to walk in such fearful cold. It was the time to lie snug in a hole in the snow and wait for the cold to be gone. But there was no intimacy between the dog and the man. The one was the slave of the other. The dog made no effort to communicate his apprehension to the man. It was not concerned for the welfare of the man. It was for its own sake that it yearned to return to the fire. But the man whistled and spoke to it with the threat of a whip. The dog swung in and followed at the man's heels. For half an hour, the man saw no signs of danger of springs under the snow. And then it happened. At a place where there were no signs, where the soft, unbroken snow seemed solid beneath, the ground broke through. It was not deep. He got wet halfway to the knees before he floundered out to firm ground. He was angry. He cursed his luck aloud. This would delay him an hour. He would have to build a fire and dry out his footgear. This was crucial at this low temperature. He knew that much. He searched the underbrush among the trunks of the small spruce trees and found a deposit of dry firewood, mostly sticks and twigs, but also larger pieces of seasoned branches and fine dry grasses from last year. He threw down several large pieces on top of the snow. This served as a foundation and prevented the young flame from being drowned in the melting snow. He got the flame started by touching a match to a small shred of birch bark that he took from his pocket. Placing it on the foundation, he fed the flame with wisps of dry grass and the tiniest dry twigs. He worked slowly and carefully, keenly aware of danger. Gradually, as the flame grew stronger, he increased the size of the twigs. He squatted in the snow, pulling the twigs out and feeding them directly to the flame. He knew he must not fail. In such extreme cold, a man must not fail in his first attempt to build a fire, especially if his feet are wet. If his feet are dry, he can run along the trail and restore his circulation, but his feet were wet and freezing. No matter how fast he ran, his feet would only freeze harder. Already all sensation was gone from the feet. To build the fire, he had been forced to remove his mittens, and his fingers had quickly gone numb. His pace of 4 miles per hour had kept his heart pumping blood to the surface of his body, to his extremities, his hands, his feet. The blood had a life of its own, like the dog, and like the dog, it wanted to hide away and cover up from the fearful cold. So long as he walked his 4-mile-per-hour pace, he pumped blood to the surface. But now it ebbed away and sank down into the recesses of his body. His extremities were the first to feel its absence. His wet feet froze faster. His exposed fingers numbed faster, though they had not yet begun to freeze. His nose and cheeks were already freezing while the skin of all his body chilled as the blood failed to pump. But he was safe. Toes and nose and cheeks would only be touched by the frost because the fire was beginning to burn with strength. He was feeding it twigs the size of his finger. In another minute, he would be able to feed it with branches the size of his wrist. And then he could remove his wet footgear. While it dried, he could keep his naked feet warm by the fire. The fire was a success. He was safe. He again remembered the advice of the old-timer and smiled. The old-timer had been very serious in laying down the law. No man should travel alone in the Yukon when it was 50 degrees below. Well, here he was. He had the accident. He was alone, and yet he had saved himself. Some of those old-timers were womanish. He thought, wow, man. All a man had to do was keep his head, and he was all right. Any man who was a man could travel alone. But still, it was surprising how quickly his cheeks and nose were freezing. And he had not thought that his fingers could feel so lifeless in so short a time. But lifeless they were. He could scarcely make them move together to grasp twigs, and they seemed remote from his body and from him. When he touched the twig, he had to look to see whether he had hold of it. He was so numb that there was no sensation between him and his fingertips.